The darkness enveloped the hospital like a second skin. It was always like this during the night shift. The heavy silence of the late hours was only broken by the distant hum of monitoring machines and, occasionally, the slow footsteps of a nurse making their rounds. For Lucas, this shift was familiar, almost comforting, despite the cold atmosphere that took over the empty hallways. He'd worked there for over 5 years, and to him, nothing felt more natural than the solitude and calm that settled in the hospital once the last visitor of the day had left and the patients were asleep. He spent most of the night going over patient records, adjusting medical equipment, and doing quick rounds in the rooms. It was a repetitive job, but it gave him a sense of control. He didn't expect tonight to be any different. However, that night, something unusual happened. As he walked past the psychiatric ward, Lucas noticed movement in room 407, one of the most isolated rooms in the hospital. It wasn't common to see patients awake at that hour. The weak light of a bedside lamp flickered dimly, and a shadow could be seen sitting on the bed, staring blankly at the wall. Lucas approached cautiously. The patient was a man who looked tired, maybe in his 50s, but his gaze didn't match his age. His eyes were empty, as if he was seeing something beyond what others could perceive. When Lucas entered the room, the man looked at him without surprise, as if he had already been expecting him. "Are you the nurse for tonight?" the patient asked, his voice soft, but with a strangeness that immediately made the hairs on the back of Lucas's neck stand up. "Yes, that's me," Lucas replied, trying to mask his discomfort. "Is everything okay, sir?" The man gave a weak smile, but his eyes remained hollow. "I need help." His voice wavered, but there was no sign of pain on his face. "I need to escape." Lucas furrowed his brow, confused. The word escape didn't seem to fit in a medical context. Escape? From what? "What's going on?" he asked, stepping a little closer but keeping a respectful distance. He knew patients with psychiatric disorders sometimes said nonsensical things, but there was something in his words that didn't seem related to any known condition. The man looked at him with a pleading expression, but didn't say anything else. He only repeated the same phrase. "I need to escape." Lucas tried to make sense of it, but the conversation was heading in a direction he couldn't follow. He stepped back a little, trying to keep control of the situation. It was his job to care for these patients, not to get involved in their delusions. But something about that empty stare unsettled him deeply. "I'll check your record, sir. Maybe we can adjust your medication," Lucas said, still unsure what to make of the encounter. He quickly left the room and headed to the records room. Something was off, but he didn't quite know what. When he opened the patient's file, Lucas came across an unusual entry. The patient, named Samuel Cruz, had been there for months, but there was no indication of any significant physical or mental illness. His medical history was clean, but something else caught his eye. The date of his admission. It matched a period when rumors about secret experiments had been circulating through the hospital halls. Many of the staff whispered about questionable practices in the psychiatric ward, but they were just rumors, or so Lucas thought. With the file in hand, Lucas looked back toward room 407, where the man was still sitting silently, as if nothing had happened. The feeling of unease grew with every passing second. He knew something was wrong, but at that moment, he had no idea that this simple visit to the strange patient and his sudden request to escape would be the beginning of a journey that would lead him to a dark secret, far darker than he ever imagined. In the days that followed, Lucas couldn't get Samuel Cruz out of his mind. There was something about those empty eyes, those repetitive cries for help, that echoed in his mind. The patient seemed untouched by any physical ailment. His mental state, though unsettling, didn't seem to justify his constant presence in the psychiatric ward. And the request to escape, it still didn't make any sense. He knew he shouldn't let the strange words of a patient get to him, but something about Samuel challenged him to question what was really going on. When his night shift came around, Lucas decided to investigate further. The hospital had always been known for its commitment to medical treatment, but there was something odd in the halls, like an invisible mist lingering over the place, hiding dark truths. When he arrived at room 407 that night, Lucas prepared himself to find the patient in the same state as the other days, calm, introspective, almost motionless. But when he opened the door, he was greeted by an unusual scene. Samuel wasn't sitting on his bed like before. He was standing, staring out the window, and didn't react when Lucas entered the room. His posture was stiff, almost as if he was no longer human, but a statue waiting for time to pass. Lucas stepped forward, breaking the tense silence that filled the room. "Mr. Cruz?" Lucas asked, trying to get his attention. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Samuel slowly turned his head, his eyes still empty, but something had changed. The smile that appeared on his face was not comforting. It was a distant, almost unsettling smile. "You came, finally." His voice was stronger, clearer, but still carried an unsettling strangeness. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine, but he kept his composure. "I came because I need to understand what's happening." "What do you mean by escape? What are you talking about, Samuel?" The man just slowly shook his head, as if he knew Lucas wasn't ready to understand. He took a step toward Lucas, and the nurse felt a sudden pressure in the air, as if the environment around them was changing. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, as though something was distorting the space. "I'm not what you think I am." Samuel's voice shifted, becoming deeper and almost inhuman. "Neither are you, Lucas." Lucas took a step back, feeling the weight of those words reverberating in his mind. Before he could say anything, Samuel raised his hand, pointing toward the empty hospital hallway. "Out there, there's more than you can see. What's here doesn't belong to this world. I'm just a reflection of what you don't yet understand." Samuel's words hung in the air like an unsaid prophecy. Lucas, in shock, could no longer find a proper response. The atmosphere in the room seemed to have transformed. The air was thick, heavy with something he couldn't identify. Before he could respond, Samuel sat back down on his bed, and his expression returned to apathy. He was still again, as if nothing had happened. Lucas, still stunned, closed the door behind him and walked down the hallway, feeling as though he was losing control of the situation. What had just happened? He glanced back at Samuel Cruz's file, now more confused than ever. What did he mean by, "I'm not what you think"? What did those words about reflections and alternate worlds mean? In his heart, Lucas felt that he was on the brink of something much larger, something that transcended his understanding of the hospital and what he believed to be real. That night, he could no longer believe this was just a coincidence. Something far more sinister was unfolding, and Samuel Cruz was undoubtedly the key to this mystery. The following night was a silent torment for Lucas. When his shift started, he couldn't stop thinking about Samuel Cruz and the cryptic words he had said. "I'm not what you think I am. Out there, there's more than you can see." Those words still echoed in his mind, becoming an increasingly unsolvable riddle. Lucas no longer knew what was real and what was part of a disturbing illusion. He felt like the hospital's walls were slowly closing in around him. As he passed the psychiatric ward again, he couldn't help but look toward room 407. Something was wrong. He felt it in every fiber of his being, a sensation of presence, as if the space itself was being distorted. He knew he had to understand what was happening, but he didn't know where to start. It was then, during his rounds, that he came across something that made him stop. At the entrance to the medical records room, something was out of place. A folder had fallen to the ground, open. He quickly crouched to pick it up. What he found wasn't in the records he normally accessed. That folder seemed to have been left on purpose. But by whom? He glanced quickly around. The hallway was empty, as it always was at that time of night. With a growing sense of unease, Lucas began to flip through the pages. The content was partially erased, but enough was legible for him to start making connections. The name Samuel Cruz appeared several times, but what caught his attention was a symbol that seemed to have been hand-drawn, almost like a mark, a seal of some kind. He had never seen it before, but something about it felt deeply familiar, as if he had encountered it at some point in his life. The symbol was etched on a series of documents, seemingly old, and some of them referenced experiments carried out at the hospital. But the passages were vague, almost incomprehensible, as if whoever had written them had been forced to erase or conceal crucial parts of the information. The word project appeared several times, but the project name was crossed out, a clear attempt to hide its true purpose. Psychological experimentation? Lucas murmured to himself, looking at the papers more closely. The pages talked about patients who had mysteriously disappeared, their names listed as non-recoverable or lost during recovery. All of this seemed to connect directly to what Samuel had said about escaping. With his heart racing, Lucas looked at the clock. He was in the middle of his shift, and the feeling of being watched began to overwhelm him. He decided he needed to speak to Samuel Cruz again, not just to understand what was happening, but to find out more about what he knew. Something was deeply wrong, and the only way to uncover the truth was to confront the mysterious patient once more. He made his way to room 407, his mind filled with unanswered questions. The door was slightly ajar, but as he entered, he was confronted with something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Samuel wasn't in the bed. He wasn't in the chair. The room was empty, but the window was open. A light breeze drifted in, swaying the curtains. What was even more unsettling, though, was the sound. A soft melody, almost inaudible, was coming from inside the room. It was as if someone had left a song playing. Lucas cautiously entered the room and followed the sound until he reached the wall, where a small music box sat on a table. It was playing a melody that, although familiar, he couldn't quite place. As he looked closer, he saw that the music box was open, and inside it was a photo. The photo was of a man who looked like Samuel, but much younger. He was smiling, but something about the smile seemed off, like it was forced. When Lucas picked up the photo, a chill ran down his spine. He knew he was in a situation he couldn't control anymore. The clues were connecting in a terrifying way, but there was still something he couldn't understand. The moment he did, a wave of dizziness hit him, and a rush of heat flooded his body. The room seemed to spin for a moment, and when he looked out the window, the view was distorted, as if time itself had twisted. He blinked several times, trying to focus, but the images outside the window seemed to move on their own, as if something was crawling through the shadows. That's when he heard it. A voice, soft but clear, whispering his name. Lucas. He turned quickly, his heart racing. The voice wasn't coming from anyone visible. It was as if it had emerged from the very air itself, but it was unmistakable. He heard it again, louder this time, coming from inside the room. Lucas, you're closer than you think. Samuel, that unmistakable voice of Samuel Cruz. With his body tense, Lucas approached the bed where the patient lay, still motionless. His eyes were closed, but his breathing was stronger, more labored. Lucas didn't know what to expect, but he felt he was on the verge of discovering something that would change everything. Samuel? He whispered, moving closer. Suddenly, Samuel's eyes opened, not with the same apathy as before, but with an intensity that made Lucas's spine freeze. The eyes, once empty, were now filled with something indescribable, something distant, as if they no longer belonged to this world. I knew you would come, Samuel said, his voice now low and almost imperceptible, but carrying an ancient weight. You're starting to see it, aren't you? What's beyond this place? Lucas couldn't respond. He was paralyzed. It was as if the space around him was becoming more and more unreal. The air felt thick, the sounds muffled and reality distorted. The hospital? It's not just a hospital. Samuel continued, his eyes locked onto Lucas, as if trying to pierce his soul. It's a gateway. Many come here and never leave. They stay trapped. Lucas felt a deep shiver run down his spine. He didn't want to believe it, but Samuel's words were making too much sense, more than he'd like. He looked around, as if expecting to see something, any evidence that this wasn't just a hallucination. Trapped? What do you mean? What are you saying? Lucas asked, his voice trembling, but his curiosity was blending with the rising fear. Samuel took a deep breath, as if preparing to share something even he didn't want to reveal. The hospital was built on an ancient site, a place of rituals, of old pacts. What you're seeing here, it's not what it seems. The people who disappear, the patients who never get better, all of it is part of something bigger, something that's been here for a long time. This place, it's like a prison and some of us never leave. He paused for a moment, seeming to struggle with his own words, as if they carried an immense weight. I was chosen to stay, but now you've been chosen too. Lucas felt the pressure in his chest intensify. He was starting to understand, but at the same time, confusion overwhelmed him. What did he mean by chosen? And how did that explain the strange things that had been happening, like the shadows that seemed to move on the walls, the sound of the music box, the feeling of being watched, being part of something much bigger than he could ever have imagined? Before he could ask more questions, the air in the room changed abruptly. The curtains at the window began to move, even though the breeze had stopped. The sound of wind was now replaced by a distant, muffled laugh, coming from somewhere inside the hospital. Samuel smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a smile of someone who knew there was no escape left. You've already entered the game, Lucas. And now, you'll have to play until the end. Lucas's heart raced. What did he mean by that? What was happening in this hospital? It was too late to turn back. The game had begun. The sound of the laughter seemed to echo throughout the hospital, reverberating off the walls in a distorted way, as if the building itself was laughing with Samuel. Lucas couldn't quite make sense of what was happening, but something deep inside him, something primal, knew that what he was facing wasn't something he could just explain or comprehend. He felt an overwhelming force around him, an invisible presence that was watching him, waiting. He turned to Samuel, who now seemed calmer, as if at peace with whatever was going on. His eyes, once empty, were now fixed on Lucas, as though the young nurse was the last person in a world of ghosts. What do you want from me? Lucas asked, his voice hoarse, nearly suffocated by the growing fear. Samuel didn't answer right away. He slowly sat up from the bed, his thin, pale body moving strangely, as if each muscle was being forced to do something it didn't want to. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep, as though he were speaking from a faraway place. What I want from you, Lucas, no longer matters. What matters now is that you're here. That's all that matters. He paused, his eyes seeming to look beyond Lucas, as if he were seeing something no one else could see. The hospital is not what you think. It's just the surface of something much deeper, something buried beneath the foundations of this place. And you're about to uncover all of it. Lucas tried to take a step back, but his legs felt heavy, as though some invisible force was holding him in place. The door to the room was shut, but he couldn't help but keep staring at it, wondering if there was any chance of escape. But before he could move, Samuel made a gesture with his hand, and the curtains at the window slammed shut with a thud, as if an unseen force had yanked them. The room was now in total darkness, except for the faint light from Lucas's flashlight. He looked at Samuel, who seemed to absorb the darkness around him, as if he were part of it. The man looked at him, his smile now wider, but not in a friendly way. It was the smile of a predator who knew the hunt was reaching its final moments. What you're about to discover here, Lucas, there's no going back. Samuel continued, now in a more serious tone, almost with a hint of pity. There's no escape for you anymore. You're going to learn the truth, and it will be more than you can bear. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know whether all of this was a metaphor, psychological torture, or something even worse. But what he knew was that the hospital, with its cold walls and endless hallways, was more than just a place of healing. It was a maze, a mental prison, and now he was trapped inside it. An increasing sense of despair engulfed him, but he forced himself to stay composed. He needed to know more. He needed to understand what Samuel was saying. Something inside him urged him to press on, as if his curiosity was stronger than his fear. "What's happening here?" Lucas asked, his voice now steadier, despite the rising panic. "What is this place?" Samuel just smiled, but there was something in his eyes, a deep sadness that Lucas couldn't comprehend. It was then that Samuel spoke again, but his words were different, as if something in his mind was breaking. "You want to know, Lucas? Are you ready to see the truth? There's no turning back. Not after everything you've seen. Not after stepping into this game." Before Lucas could respond, something happened. The flashlight he was holding flickered and went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. The sound of something dragging, like heavy footsteps, echoed through the room. Lucas looked around, feeling the pressure intensify, as if the air was becoming thicker and hotter. He heard something whisper in his ear, a low voice, almost inaudible, but filled with malice. "They're coming!" The footsteps grew louder, closer. Something was getting closer, and Lucas could feel his breath quickening. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. The shadows on the wall started to stretch and twist, as if they were coming to life. He looked at Samuel, hoping for some kind of explanation, but the patient stood still, motionless, his eyes fixed on some point beyond Lucas, as if seeing something he couldn't. Then the hospital lights started flickering, first slowly, then faster, until finally, a bright light lit up the room, revealing a scene Lucas could never have prepared himself for. In the center of the room, the shadows that had stretched out now took shape. They were indistinct figures, like wraiths, but with a palpable presence, a pressure that made Lucas' heart race. They began moving, circling around him, as if they were approaching for something. Something horrible, something final. Samuel, who had previously seemed at the mercy of what was happening, now appeared calm. He looked at Lucas with an enigmatic expression, as if he knew exactly what was going on. He didn't say a word, but his presence was more powerful than any words could be. Lucas didn't know what to do. Reality seemed to have distorted in an irreversible way, and he was at the center of something much larger than he could comprehend. He had entered the game, and now the game was about to end. The light in the hospital lamps flickered again, once more, faster, until finally the lights went out completely. However, the room didn't go dark. There was a faint, almost ethereal light emanating from the center of the room, where the shadows had now formed a circle. And there, in the center, what Lucas saw made his heart stop for a moment. It was a mirror, but not an ordinary one. It seemed to distort the space around it, as if it were a window into another place. The glass was opaque, but there was something moving behind it, something that didn't belong to reality. Lucas took a hesitant step forward, but an inexplicable force pushed him. He was being drawn toward that light, as if the mirror were a door to something he couldn't avoid. "You must look. You must see." Samuel's voice sounded again, but this time it seemed distant, as if echoing from an abyss. Lucas reached out his hand, almost uncontrollably, and touched the surface of the mirror. As soon as his finger made contact, an electric shock ran through his body, and the vision before him began to change. The mirror, which had once been a distorted reflection of the environment, now showed a macabre scene. He was seeing the hospital, but not as he knew it. The walls were corroded, and the floor was covered in a viscous, dark substance that seemed to move as if it were a living organism. In the center of the room, a human figure lay on the floor, its body deformed and twisted. It was someone, but Lucas couldn't identify who. His heart raced when he recognized the face, or at least the features. It was him, but it wasn't. He tried to step away from the mirror, but something stopped him. An unbearable pressure forced him to look, and the vision of his own body, distorted and mutilated, overwhelmed his mind. It was a reflection of what he could become, a vision of the future he couldn't understand. He heard the laughter again, this time coming from all directions. It was the sound of many voices blending together, laughing in unison, as if the entire hospital were mocking his existence. "Do you see it, Lucas?" Samuel's voice returned, now deeper, more threatening. "You wanted to know the truth. Now you're seeing it." Lucas tried to scream, but his voice didn't come out. He felt the pressure in his chest increase, the sensation of being crushed by the reality he was now immersed in. The shadowy figures began to move closer to him, their eyes glowing with a sickly red hue. They didn't speak, but every movement seemed to communicate one message. He was lost. Yet, something inside him still resisted. He couldn't be the victim. Not like this. He was trapped in a game, but he wouldn't be the pawn. Not if he was the one controlling the game. He screamed, this time with all his strength, trying to break free from the horrible vision. And when he did, something unexpected happened. The shadows pulled back. The mirror distorted, as if being pushed by an invisible force. Lucas felt a momentary relief, but he knew it wouldn't last. He had triggered something. Somehow, he had broken the rules of that place. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Samuel's voice said, now with a tone of frustration. You can't escape, Lucas. You're in the game now, and there's no way out. But before he could respond, the hospital began to shake. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, everything was disintegrating, falling apart in pieces as if the very space itself was collapsing. The shadowy figures disappeared, and the light from the mirror, now weak and pulsating, was the last thing Lucas saw before being engulfed by total darkness. And then, silence took over. With the total darkness and absolute silence, Lucas didn't know if he was awake or if he had fallen into some kind of deep abyss. What was real now? What had happened to the hospital? The sound of his breathing was the only thing he could distinguish, slow and heavy, and the beating of his heart echoed in his head. But then, as if the darkness had a will of its own, a light began to shine. It was faint at first, but grew stronger and stronger until a figure appeared before him. It wasn't Samuel. It wasn't one of the shadows. It was something that seemed human, but at the same time, it wasn't. The being looked directly into Lucas' eyes, and its gaze made the nurse feel something he never imagined was possible. A deep and primal terror, something that didn't originate in his mind, but in his most primitive instincts. It was as if he were looking at the personification of fear, something that existed before everything he knew. You already know what happened here. The figure's voice spoke, its mouth not moving, but the words coming into Lucas' mind like a distant echo. You were chosen. Lucas couldn't respond. He felt a pressure in his throat, as if his words were trapped, as if the very atmosphere was trying to stop him from speaking. But now, you have a choice, the figure continued. You can go back to your world, or you can join us. The words reverberated, and Lucas felt a wave of despair in his chest. What did that mean? Go back? To where? What was happening? Samuel? Lucas managed to mumble, his voice hoarse and tense. Where is Samuel? The figure smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a cold, distant smile, as if looking at something it had already given up on long ago. Samuel is no longer here. He made his choice. He stayed. Those words lingered in Lucas' mind, echoing. He tried to move, but his legs felt paralyzed. The sensation of being trapped, of having no control over his own body, took over him. He was being dragged into something bigger, something he couldn't comprehend. The figure took a step toward Lucas, its hands extending as if inviting him to a fate that had already been sealed. The light emanating from it began to envelop Lucas, and he could no longer distinguish between the darkness and the light. It was all the same, an amorphous mass, swallowing everything, swallowing him too. He felt his mind waver. The memories of the hospital, of Samuel, of the shadowy figures, all of it mixed with a growing sense of panic. He was losing control. What little was left of his sanity was quickly fading, and he knew that once the choice was made, there would be no turning back. Not for him. Not for anyone who had come this far. "Choose, Lucas," the figure said again, its voice growing stronger, more forceful. "You don't have time anymore." And suddenly, everything became clear. He realized, in a terrible and agonizing way, that there was no choice to be made. The hospital, Samuel, the shadows, all of it was part of something much bigger, something that fed on fear and hopelessness. He had been part of this game from the moment he walked in on his first night at work. He had become part of the hospital, part of the cycle, and now he would be the next. The figure gave one last smile, a smile that said everything without needing words. "Welcome to the truth." With one final breath, Lucas was consumed by the darkness, and with him, all his memories and hopes vanished, swallowed by what he could never have imagined.